In this section, we're going to talk about cell membranes in detail, just because they're so important. So the cell membrane is the boundary between the inside of the cell and the rest of the world. So it basically separates the inside of the living thing from everything else. It has a selectively permeable membrane, and we'll talk about what that means. It's also a phospholipid bilayer that contains several different kinds of molecules, proteins, other lipids, and some hybrid molecules that we'll also talk about momentarily. So here's a great picture of a cross-section of a cell membrane. And so we got lots of different things here. These are phospholipids. And a phospholipid by itself kind of looks like that. And so the phospholipid bilayer, that means that there are two layers of phospholipids, and their orientation is important. So the hydrophobic part, which doesn't like to interact with water, is on the inside, and the hydrophilic part, which does like to interact with water, is on the outside. So we've also got some proteins, like here and here, and we've got some hybrid molecules, such as right here. This could be a glycoprotein or a glycolipid, and those are important for signaling and cell identification. So let's talk about elective permeability. This is the fact that the membrane doesn't just allow anything to go through it. It allows some things to pass and other things cannot go through. So the membrane has control over what comes in and goes out of the cell, which is great for the cell because it helps it to control what comes in and goes out of the cell as a whole. So there are two types of transport. The membrane can allow things to pass through just passively by themselves. This doesn't require any energy, but it does require a doorway protein, which is a protein that's embedded in the membrane. So you might expect to have a protein that might sit like this, and that can serve as a doorway. So passive transport requires no energy. Active transport requires both energy and a doorway protein. Now, diffusion is one type of passive transport. So this is movement of molecules from higher to lower concentrations. And so what that would look like is if you've got a whole bunch of molecules that are all hanging out over here, and there aren't any of them over here, eventually some of them are going to just float over that way as a result of their random motion. And so you might think that you have no idea what this means, but if you've ever had someone open a bottle of perfume or put a skunk in one corner of the room and eventually you could smell either at the other end of the room, that's an example of diffusion. So the scent molecules floated from one end to the other end. So from higher to lower concentrations. Osmosis is a particular type of passive transport, specifically dealing with water. So these here in this picture are little water molecules. This and this are phospholipids, and so the water molecule here is floating through the membrane. So osmosis, which is the special diffusion of water, functions the same way as all other kinds of diffusion. It goes from higher to lower concentration. So when we use the term osmosis, we're specifically talking about diffusion of water. So facilitated diffusion is just diffusion that uses a doorway, and that's a protein that serves as like a tunnel that allows certain molecules to go through it, and the protein that is the doorway is always very specific for what types of molecules it allows to go through. So here's an example of some facilitated diffusion doorway proteins. An example here. This protein actually changes shape when the molecule that is going to pass through enters inside it. So it's open on one end, and the molecule that's going to diffuse through is floating into the protein, and then the protein changes its shape here, and then it changes its shape again and releases that molecule into the inside of the cell, or outside the cell, depending on what you're talking about. And so in this case, the molecule that is being moved across the membrane is glucose. Now, active transport requires both energy and a doorway protein. It's called active transport because energy is required. Now this is really useful for the cell because it can get molecules to move against their concentration gradient. And this is against what would normally happen if the molecules were just diffusing. So let's imagine that you've got a cell membrane here, which is your bilayer, and you've got a high concentration of some kind of solute molecule here, but your cell wants to have a high concentration over here. Your cell can use active transport to move these molecules either against or with their concentration gradient. And so at first, you'd be moving these molecules across and they would be going with their concentration gradient so they could diffuse. But after a while, the concentration of them would build up on this side, and if your cell still needed to have them on that side, it could use these proteins to push it against its concentration gradient, which is really helpful for things like nerve signaling. So while you're paying attention to this video, you've got all kinds of neurons doing things in your body, and part of the reason they do that is because of active transport of moving ions. And so a calcium-sodium pump is one example of a protein that is an active transporter. Now, bulk transport is another example of active transport, and we call it bulk because we're talking about large particles that can't just fit through, say, a little membrane protein like this. So with bulk transport, lots of little particles or one great big particle, either way, they can't go through a transport protein. And so what happens is the cell creates a pinched off area that is sort of like forming a little vessel around the protein or the molecules that are going to be taken into or moved out of the cell. And so eventually this little vesicle pinches off, and what you end up with is this. So you've got your membrane bilayers here, and then whatever the cell is trying to export or import is right there on the inside. And so that's bulk transport. So make sure that you pay attention to, in the supplemental readings, the difference between active transport and passive transport and important types of each.